The NFL free agent negotiation period begins on Monday, so we're putting together a Chicago Bears free agent wish list, looking at the top targets, a good backup plan if you can't get that top guy, and maybe even a player you would be okay with settling for if you really miss out on the guys you actually wanted.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, we preview the upcoming free agency with a lot of cap space for the Chicago Bears and a handful of needs across the roster that they're going to be able to fill. So we'll go through each of the key positions for the Bears: wide receiver, tight end, center, defensive tackle, edge rusher, and safety, to look at who the top targets should be, who maybe some of the backup plans might be, and then who you'd be okay with settling for if you miss out on some of those top guys across the board. A lot of names to go through here. So let's jump right in with the wide receivers to start, the pass catchers. The Bears need at least one, if not multiple, additional complementary receivers to go with DJ Moore. So the Bears, I don't see them as a team in the market for like the very tip top of the wide receiver market. You know, like obviously T. Higgins and Michael Pittman have already been franchise tagged, but even, and Mike Evans, I guess, re-signed, but you know, the number one caliber guys like a Calvin Ridley, or even, I mean, Marquise Brown, you can debate whether he's a number one receiver, but like those guys that are really going to get pretty big payouts, I don't think the Bears are quite in the market for those type of guys. But if I'm trying to target a really good complementary number two wide receiver who maybe has some number one receiver upside, you can certainly make a strong argument for Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills, but the guy I'm really keying in on is Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals. We've seen him be a 1,000-yard receiver before in his career. We've seen him be a consistent producer each and every year, albeit 2023 is coming on some slightly down trend for him, so maybe you'll save a little bit of money, but he's still only 29, and he does like all the dirty work. He is a football culture guy. Everybody in Cincinnati raves about like how he works hard at practice, how he sets the example for the young people, how he doesn't mind doing things and not getting as much credit for it. And he's really good at like fitting in alongside when you already have the number one. You know, he started behind AJ Green there, and he's not going to complain if he doesn't get all the targets. And of course, he gets behind Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and you could say, well, he never emerged past those guys, sure, but you don't need him to be a number one receiver in Chicago. He can be a really solid, consistent veteran number two guy that can win up and down the field for you and feel like, man, the Bears got themselves a good one here on a team that just couldn't continue to afford to keep three really expensive receivers. I don't think they're letting Tyler Boyd hit free agency because he's not very good or because they don't want him, but just because they're already spending so much on Chase and Higgins. And so it's a great opportunity for the Bears to get a player who I think can be better in Chicago as a number two than he's been as a number three in Cincinnati the last couple of seasons. If they can't get Boyd, if he's a little more expensive than they want, or for whatever reason, if he somehow re-signs with Cincinnati, a nice consolation prize there might be Curtis Samuel, who used to be teammates with DJ Moore on the Carolina Panthers, spent the last handful of seasons with the Washington Commanders, and is an effective receiver at all areas of the field for them. You know, he's a little bit smaller, and they use him as a ball carrier sometimes in the backfield. He can do some of the gadget stuff, but he's not exclusively that. I mean, he can line up on the outside. He can win over the middle of the field. He can win deep. Like, he can do a little bit of everything. Not at an elite level. He's not a number one guy. He's never been a 1,000-yard receiver. But as a number two, I mean, ideally, maybe you would want him as a number three. If you draft a receiver in the first round, if you're the Chicago Bears, Curtis Samuel could be a number three, just like Tyler Boyd could be your number three if at the 9th overall pick you get Rome Odunze or Malik Neighbors or however that plays out. Like, that's what's nice about both these guys. If you need them as your two, they can get the job done, but they're not going to be out of place as a number three or upset if they end up being a number three in your offense. If you can't get any of those top guys, And you know what? We want to go a little bit cheaper at wide receiver. Like, say you're Ryan Poles and you think, well, we can get a good wide receiver in the draft. We don't need to spend big money at receiver. We're already paying for DJ Moore. Can we get someone who costs a little bit less, like without scraping the bottom of the barrel? Because you still need a talented receiver there. I look at Josh Reynolds, most recently with the Detroit Lions this past season, but has spent time in the past on the Los Angeles Rams with Shane Waldron as his coach, with Bears passing game coordinator Thomas Brown as his coach. To me, Josh Reynolds is a guy who's like, he's not great at anything. He's not the biggest. He's not the fastest. He's not the strongest, but he's smart. He runs good routes. He wins. He catches the ball consistently. He's a good run blocker as well. Like, he's a fabric kind of guy, a scheme kind of guy in a decent offense. He can be a really good number 3 or a low end number 2, and not going to cost you, $10-12 million that some of the other guys might. I mean, maybe you can get him for more like 6 or 7 and feel like that's a pretty good complementary piece, and then maybe add a rookie wide receiver in the draft, and you're starting to fill out a wide receiver core. Like, you're settling a little bit more for Josh Reynolds, but I wouldn't be upset if they settled for Josh Reynolds at wide receiver. But ideally, you'd like to aim higher, but you can only spend so much at so many positions and put so much money in wide receiver, and maybe that's a spot you spend a little less on, and maybe you go for a higher end number 2 tight end. I mean, no one's under contract after Cole Kmet on this tight end depth chart right now. I think the top of the list has to be Gerald Everett, formerly of the Rams, formerly of the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, he's worked with Shane Waldron and company at a few different stops now. He's still one of the better missed tackle forcers in the NFL. Spent the last couple seasons with the Los Angeles Chargers. He's never been like a dominant number 1 tight end, but as a number 2 behind Cole Kmet, he can do a lot of different things for you in the offense. And I think he's a guy who adds a little bit more of a dynamic playmaking ability there, even if he's not as good of a blocker, but he can have some speed and add a little extra dynamic at that tight end spot that we kind of hoped Robert Tonyan would be last season. Right up there with him, I'd say, as a consolation prize. And you could probably argue either of these guys as number 1 or number 2 target for the Bears, but another Seattle Seahawk, Noah Fant. Well familiar with this Shane Waldron offense from the last couple of seasons, coming over there from the Denver Broncos. To me, Fant offers more speed and more of that style of like athletic ability at tight end than Gerald Everett. He's a little bit younger, but Everett's a little bit more shifty, whereas Fant is a little bit more like kind of explosive in that way, but more of a vertical threat as well, whereas Everett, I think, is a little bit more of an after-the-catch guy. I think either one would be a great compliment to Cole Kmet. Fant might go get a starting job somewhere else and not want to come be a number 2 in Chicago. So if you have to settle, there's a whole bunch of Seattle Seahawks tight ends sitting there waiting for you in the free agent market, whether it's Colby Parkinson or they just released Will Dissly. Either one of those guys would be a really solid, like, okay, we'll settle for him as a number 2 receiver, a number 2 tight end who, is not going to be a 600-yard guy, but he'll catch the security blanket passes when you check it down to him. He'll be a good blocker coming off the bench as a number 2 guy. They'll know the system so they can come in, plug right away, and help the other tight ends learn it and help just generally be a leader on that offense. Like, I would imagine if they don't get one of these top tight ends, then it's one of these ex-Seahawks backup tight ends that will likely follow Shane Waldron with him to Chicago, as they need a couple of tight ends to really fill out that tight end depth chart. So not like big-time, big-name starting type players at either of those spots, not positions where the Bears are going to break the bank, but looking for some quality playmakers to keep complementing this offense around, presumably, Caleb Williams at quarterback. I'd also like to still see them address the center position, even after trading for Ryan Bates, to be determined if they will, but we'll look at some of the top options there, and then we'll turn our attention to the defensive line as well, where I think the real prize is in free agency. If the Bears are going to spend big, are going to be on that defensive line next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA too? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on that 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is only good through April 30th. Get started at Robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. We'll see if Ryan Poles wants to do anything else at center beyond the trade for Buffalo Bills backup Ryan Bates, who we talked about on the podcast on Wednesday. So go take a look to that if you have not heard that yet. And we're sort of hearing conflicting reports about whether or not Poles sees Bates as the starter at center or how he fits into these plans. My general approach throughout the offseason is anytime the Bears make a move, don't overreact to one move of any kind in a vacuum. Like, let's wait and see what the plan is at center for the offensive line before we say either bad trade or good trade by Ryan Poles, or this is not enough at center. I mean, let's see what else he does, and then we can say at the end, okay, wow, he did not do enough at center, or he did do enough at center. I don't think Ryan Bates should preclude him from going out and signing another potential center, like more of a true starter, whereas Bates can be a really valuable, versatile backup for them. We'll see what they do, but I think at the top of the list for as far as a Bears center fit goes, I would say Lloyd Cushenberry, the center from the Denver Broncos. He's a guy who would be a good scheme fit. He's big, strong, but also moves well and is generally like more or less, I don't want to say the consensus top center. There's a strong argument for Andre James from the Las Vegas Raiders, but like Cushenberry's been a guy who's been developed over the years, has become a very consistent grader for them in terms of like road grading in the ground game and also being consistent in the passing game. Not a ton of penalties, good consistent snapping. Like, he's a really solid center. He's not particularly old. He can really lock that spot down for 3 or 4 years. And I imagine he'll have a lot of interest on the free agent market, assuming Denver doesn't re-sign him this weekend while waiting for it. That's the other asterisk here. It's like maybe by the time you listen to this podcast, a couple of these guys that we talk about may end up re-signing with their teams. And that's the dangerous part about the fast-moving free agency. But presumably, if Ryan Poles is giving up a 5th-round pick to go get Ryan Bates, then he's probably not going to then go spend top dollar at center. He could still bring in another center, but I don't know that he's going to trade a late-round draft pick for a center making $4 million and then go spend a top-of-the-market contract on a center to really put a ton of money and ton of resources at that one position. I would imagine if he does do something else at center, it'll be a little bit lower down the list. So I would definitely put a Tyler Biadasz of the Dallas Cowboys as my backup plan. Like, okay, if I'm not going to spend big on the center position, then he could be a guy that's worth having a look at. That another athletic, mobile center that you feel like can really fit this scheme well in terms of the zone kind of running that they're going to do under Shane Waldron. It should be a little different than Luke Getsy, but they still want lighter athletic centers, and that's definitely been Biadasz. He's had the occasional ups and downs, but there's been some injuries on the Dallas O-line. To me, he's still very good, but will be cheaper as a result. And I think you'd be perfectly happy with Tyler Biadasz being your guy. But if Ryan Poles says, Bates is our plan, or we're really only looking for another lower caliber center here to pair with him, if you're, I don't know, would you be happy settling with or satisfied with if Bates is just the plan? I don't think that's the end of the world. I certainly don't think Ryan Bates is going to be any worse than Lucas Patrick was last year. At the very least, you're back where you were, but there's a decent chance he's at least somewhat better than Lucas Patrick. I'd throw out as one other backup outside free agent center, Evan Brown from the Seattle Seahawks was Shane Waldron's center for just this past season in Seattle. I also don't think he was particularly great, but if you say, all right, we like Bates and we kind of like Evan Brown, have the two of them compete and the better one gets to start at center, the other one gets to be the backup. I don't hate that. I would really want to just settle the center position and say, get a guy who's the definitive, unquestioned 17-game starter. Boom. Your Lloyd Cushenberry. I think Tyler Biadasz is in the same conversation. That's how I would prefer to address that position, especially for a rookie quarterback coming in. Ryan Poles may draft a quarterback and then pair that with Ryan Bates, and then that's your center plan. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can go about it, and there's no right or there's not necessarily the only way to do it at center, but interested to see how Ryan Poles approaches it from there. Really, though, the big money in free agency, if he's going to spend it, will come on the defensive line, particularly defensive tackle, and then we'll get to edge rushers here as well in a little bit. But I think maybe the top target overall across the board, I mean, you're seeing the most talent hitting free agency, at least at the top of the position, at positions of need for the Bears is that interior defensive line. The Ravens franchise tag Justin Madubuike, but Chris Jones of the Kansas City Chiefs, not eligible for the franchise tag. He'll hit the free agent market here unless the Chiefs get a deal done at the last minute, which would not surprise me. It feels like the Chiefs are not just going to let Chris Jones walk for nothing and take the compensatory pick. Maybe, but I'm not sold on that. So I don't necessarily put Chris Jones right at the top of the list. I also don't know that, yes, Ryan Poles has the familiarity with him, but given how Chris Jones developed a reputation this season of kind of taking some plays off and not trying as hard during the regular season and then turning it on in the playoffs, that doesn't sound like the type of football players Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus have really targeted to acquire this season. And so if I'm going to put my top target at defensive tackle, it's Christian Wilkins from the Miami Dolphins. Like, that's a guy who is a butt kicker, who works hard, who's effective in both the run and the pass rush. He's a lot younger. I mean, he's 28. He's not like crazy younger, but he's, as far as experience in the league goes, he's only his fifth year. Had 9 sacks this past season. Certainly a breakout type season for him, but like that you end up having to pay top dollar for the breakout type defensive tackles there. I heard at the Combine in Indianapolis that the Dolphins are trying really hard to get a deal done with him, that they weren't going to franchise tag him, but that there was some optimism in Miami that they will still be able to re-sign Christian Wilkins. So it wouldn't surprise me if Monday comes, Wilkins listens to a few offers from other teams and then ends up back with the Miami Dolphins after hearing some of those offers. Like, I'm not keeping my fingers crossed that the Bears are able to pull someone like Christian Wilkins. And then the free agent class drops off a bit from there. Like, their consolation prize, if we're saying Christian Wilkins and we're ignoring Chris Jones, or putting Chris Jones and Christian Wilkins as tied at the top, or however you want to do it, after those guys, I guess your consolation prize is kind of like a Leonard Williams type from the New York Giants. He was traded there from the Seattle Seahawks during the season. Still had a really good season. The last couple of years have been really good. He's 29, about to turn 30 this summer. And to me, like, Leonard Williams would be a nice fit as a slightly more experienced veteran that maybe you end up signing to a shorter term deal. Maybe it's 2 or 3 years, with the idea that Gervon Dexter slowly replaces him, right? If you might be signing Christian Wilkins to a 4 or 5 year deal, or Chris Jones or whatever at the top of that list. But if you could get Leonard Williams on an expensive, but like say a 2-year, $25 million deal, that might be a little cheap, but something like that, and then have Gervon Dexter ready to really kind of take over by the end of that deal, that's a nice way to kind of have the veteran mercenary in there to lock that down, but still have some opportunity for the young guys behind him to develop on this depth chart. If you miss out on all the top guys there, no Wilkins, no Williams, no Chris Jones, they're too expensive or they re-sign or whatever, I mentioned a name before on the podcast to keep an eye on, Quinton Jefferson, a former Seattle Seahawk, a former Las Vegas Raider, where he worked with the Bears defensive line coach, Travis Smith. I always end up messing up his name. Travis Smith is the defensive line coach. Also spent a year in the Buffalo Bills with Bears defensive line coach Eric Washington. I mean, he's been around the block and been around a lot of these Bears coaches. With the Jets this past season, had a career-high 6 sacks. He's not an elite pass rusher, but he's a good player. I see him as an upgrade over Justin Jones. Should be a lot cheaper than the Wilkinses and the Leonard Williamses of the world. And you can feel like, okay, we got an upgrade at that interior defensive line position. You're still going to have Gervon Dexter and those guys rotating in. And like, again, you're settling a little bit there, but I'm okay with settling for someone like Quinton Jefferson, in this case at the defensive tackle position, especially if maybe instead Ryan Poles ends up spending more on the other edge rusher opposite Montez Sweat. Like, I'm curious how he wants to balance out. You've paid Montez Sweat a lot of money. Do you want to pay an interior guy a lot of money? Do you want to pay the other edge guy a lot of money? Or do you think you can get one or both of those spots in the draft? We'll look at some of the top edge options as well as free safeties to replace Eddie Jackson in Chicago next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Game Time, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I've used Game Time to go to concerts, basketball games. I went to 2 Bears games with the Game Time app this season. It's great because not only can I see my view from my seat, so I know exactly where I'm going to sit in the venue, but I also love their all-in pricing that's got all the taxes and fees added to it, so you know exactly how much you're going to pay, and you're not going to get surprised with any of these fees at the end. Like, I saved money buying my tickets on Game Time than buying them straight through the team's website on a seat that was not a resale ticket. It was direct spot, but fewer fees just by using Game Time. Like, that's the huge advantage that I get. Plus, they got a bunch of last-minute ticket deals and flash deals that really make it that much easier to enjoy live events in your area or anywhere. So take the guesswork out of tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code, LOCKEDON, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. The Chicago Bears need to address edge rusher in some shape or form. And when you already have Montez Sweat on one side and you've got DeMarcus Walker under contract on the other side, I sort of look at it as not wanting DeMarcus Walker to be your starter this season. But if you added enough good depth in a rotation with him, you could sort of get by at that spot. But ideally, you'd like to aim higher for somebody. I mean, if you want to spend big, the name at the top of the edge rusher market is Danielle Hunter of the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings are in a tricky cap spot right now. They're trying to figure out, is Kirk Cousins coming back? And if he is, can they still afford Danielle Hunter? After that, I'd say probably not. But if they let Kirk Cousins go somewhere else and go rookie or some other cheaper option at QB, they might be able to afford to re-sign Danielle Hunter. But to me, like, Hunter's an elite pass rusher. He's a pretty darn good run defender on the edge as well. Vikings fans that I've talked to and Vikings media people are like, we don't want to see Danielle Hunter go to the Bears because we would be scared of him playing the Vikings every week, or I mean twice a year, but seeing him play in Chicago every week for the rest of that contract, like the Bears would have one of the best edge rusher duos in the NFL if they could pair Montez Sweat and Danielle Hunter. But then you're going to have two $20 million plus a year contracts at edge. Like you're going to devote, I can't do the math off the top of my head, but like 1/6 of your salary cap or something like that to the edge rusher spot. It's a lot of money to spend at the edge, but having two great edge rushers is really valuable and might be worth that kind of money there. So I could certainly see the appeal of going out and getting a Danielle Hunter. But Hunter, I just have this feeling Ryan Poles might spend big at edge rusher, but maybe not very top of the market big. Like I think having two $20+ million edge rushers is too much for him. I mean, you see contracts for Danielle Hunter in the 3-year, $65 million total kind of range, which might be a little high to pair with Sweat, but you could still spend a decent amount of money on the edge rusher spot. Could you get someone like Jonathan Greenard from the Houston Texans for more like, ideally $16, $17 million a year? I mean, that's still a lot, and it's not a huge savings, but it makes it a little bit easier to swallow and might still be more than Ryan Poles wants to spend on the edge rusher spot. But Greenard's a guy who, a little bit under the radar as a younger player, just 4 years in his career, but breakout year, 12.5 sacks in that Houston Texans defense, really developed well under DeMeco Ryans and is ready to cash in on a big deal this offseason. Like to have that kind of young dynamic playmaker on a young defensive line where Sweat's still pretty young, your interior guys are young, like that's a long-term kind of foundation there. Whereas, Danielle Hunter's closer to 30 and you're still going to get a decent run out of Danielle Hunter, but just a little bit on the older side there. Greenard's not a bad backup option. If you just say, yeah, Hunter's too expensive or he comes back to the Vikings, like there's a young guy that you feel like he is still ascending in his career. We haven't seen the best of Jonathan Greenard just yet, but we saw a really darn good player this past season in Houston. All those may be too expensive. The cheap option here that you can't be too upset about, but you just would hope they might go and do more in the NFL draft is one of the Buffalo Bills defensive ends that worked with Eric Washington in that defensive line. Either Leonard Floyd would be a much cheaper option, or the younger option there would be AJ Epinesa, who is kind of their number 3 rotational defensive end in Buffalo, where neither one of those guys do you feel great about being like, wow, that's a great pairing with Montez Sweat. But you feel like, okay, if you got Sweat on one side and on the other side you're rotating Epinesa and DeMarcus Walker, and maybe you still draft an edge rusher in the 3rd round or something like that, altogether, that group of players can put together a good, consistent edge rush, especially if you're able to address the interior pass rush with a good player. That's what it kind of comes down to is, what do I think I can get in the draft? And then what do I then have to get in free agency because I don't think I will be able to get in the draft? Am I going to get a defensive lineman in the 1st round with that 9th overall pick, or am I taking a wide receiver there? And so then if I'm not taking a defensive lineman with the 9th overall pick, then I'm waiting until the 3rd round to get a defensive lineman. And I don't know if I want to go into this season with a 3rd round pick as my plan A starter opposite Montez Sweat, or my plan A starter on the interior as my top 3 technique pass rusher to rotate with Dexter and stuff. Like, I'd like to secure those positions with someone a little bit more proven and a little bit more consistent, and then let the Dexters of the world and the Zach Pickens of the world develop on the inside. and then maybe let a 3rd-round pick this year or a 4th-round pick this year on the edge develop behind some of these veterans that you've already got. Like, let's throw free agent bodies at these positions and draft bodies at these positions. I kind of feel the same way about the safety spot, to be honest with you. You move on from Eddie Jackson. I'd like to get a veteran safety in there to really hold down that back end while you still have a generally younger secondary around him. I don't want to rely on a rookie safety as my starter, especially because it won't be a 1st-round pick. And right now the next pick is in the 3rd round. I don't necessarily want to start a 3rd-round rookie at free safety this year if I can avoid it. So go out and get somebody in free agency. A bunch of teams have been cutting their veteran safeties all throughout this offseason, including the Bears and Eddie Jackson. So the free agent safety market is deep. And that might be an incentive to not go out and get the top guy. But it sure is tempting to get somebody like Xavier McKinney from the New York Giants. I got a young playmaking safety on the back end. I know he's had some injury concerns through his career, but had a good season this year. He's had put together a couple of strong seasons. Like his talent to me is proven, and it's not like it's been every year it's been hurt. It's not like that consistent of like major injuries. So I'm not overly concerned about it, but I do think he's going to be probably the most expensive option, or at least kind of the guy I see as the top option on the market. Maybe one of the other safeties ends up getting a bigger deal for whatever reason, but to me, he's the guy that would be really fun to see on the back end in Chicago. But again, if you're Ryan Poles, it's like, well, there's a lot of quality safeties in this free agent market. Do I have to go out and get the top guy? Because there might be 10 plus starting caliber safeties out there. And boy, I'd rather spend that money on, say, the edge rusher or the defensive tackle and maybe go a little cheaper at safety, or spend that money on a better wide receiver. Like when we talk about these other positions, the top targets, the consolation prizes, or the guys you might be settling for, would you be better off maybe settling at safety a little bit more and then spending more at some of these other spots? Or do you want to really nail this safety pick? Because if I look at, a great consolation prize after Xavier McKinney, I think there's a lot of guys that really fall into that category. The one for me that stands out is Jordan Fuller from the Los Angeles Rams, but you could make a good argument for Geno Stone from the Baltimore Ravens, or Cameron Curl from the Washington Commanders had a good year this year, maybe even Jordan Whitehead from the Jets. But like Fuller to me is a guy who plays a lot of, that cover 2 deep safety in how they've changed the defense in Los Angeles quite a bit. But he's also a guy who's really consistent coming down in the running game. He's a good tackler. He's aggressive downhill. Like, he's not the guy who's going to run blitz into the backfield and make the huge tackle for loss, but like, he's going to do his job in the running game and not be a liability there. And especially towards the end of Eddie Jackson's career, it started to become a little bit more of a problem there. And I think Fuller could be a real steadying force in the running game. Still has some playmaking ability on the back end, a good coverage safety. He's just not like an elite dynamic playmaker, but he's very, very good. And he's been consistent. And I think he's a guy who would be a good fit with the Bears. If you just want to go with hey, we'll settle for the guy we know who might not be as good, but should be cheaper and has that familiarity, then it's a name we've talked about before on the podcast, Julian Blackmon from the Indianapolis Colts. He was brought in, he played cornerback a little bit in college, but then played free safety for Matt Eberflus in Indianapolis for a couple seasons. Last year, they had him play a lot more strong safety and in the slot. He can kind of do a little bit of both. So that versatility is valuable, but I don't think he's like elite at any of them. He's fine. Like, he's a starting caliber NFL safety, but he's not a top 10 safety in the NFL. I don't know if he's got that upside in him, but he's a younger player. He could hold down the fort, and then you could still draft a safety in the 4th round or even the 3rd round and develop them behind him for a couple seasons and have some good safety depth there and feel like, wow, okay, your back end is really settled with a bunch of young quality players. And maybe Blackmon playing in this secondary with these good young players with an improved pass rush in front of him could be even better in Chicago than he's been in Indianapolis. I mean, you never really know how that pans out, but the familiarity with Matt Eberflus would certainly help the Bears know what they'd be getting in that free agent and avoid some of that risk of a guy you've never been around before, never seen how he practices, how he does meetings and all that kind of stuff. Like, that's sort of the safe settle for a guy pick, that Julian Blackmon at safety. Just like AJ Epinesa on the defensive line. Okay, it's fine, I guess. You'd like to do better, but it's fine. I'm not going to be upset if that's ultimately the Bears' move. I'd love to hear who you want the Chicago Bears to target with their free agency salary cap dollars. Like, who are your top targets? Who would you be okay with settling for if they can't get the top targets? Let me know your favorites here in the comments on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, or you can tweet at Locked On Bears or post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'll be back to you Monday as the free agent tampering period begins, but the podcast comes out first thing in the morning before the tampering period begins, so we can't start reacting to these moves until Tuesday's podcast. But hey, we'll still be here for you every single day to still give you another opportunity to bear down.